Page in Bethany at the mount that is called Olivet, he sent two of the disciples, saying, "Go into the village in front of you, where on entering you untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, why are you untying it, you shall say this, the Lord has need of it."
Okay, so how is that different from what we've heard so far? We're on the third of the synoptics. Did anyone notice the difference? So in Mark he says, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find there a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it." In John, he says, I'm not Acts. In John, he says, Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it. But in Matthew is the only one. Come on, Ace.
He says, "Go into the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, you shall say, the Lord needs them, and he will send them at once."
Thank you, Dan. Anyone hear the difference?
There were two animals.
Two animals. Only Matthew has two animals. Who was Matthew?
Former tax collector and agent.
And who was he writing to?
The Jews.
The Jews. So it makes sense if we look at Zechariah 9:9. Why? Because in Zechariah 9:9, it says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion, shout, lo, your king comes to you, triumphant and riding on a donkey, on a colt." As we talked before, Matthew, speaking to the Jews, doctor, spitting out facts. These are the things you need to know. Doesn't mean that, as we talked before, it doesn't mean that one's right and one's wrong. It means that one is speaking from what he saw and the other one is speaking from what he saw.
And we should say they're also all talking to different audiences, which very much flavors what we read and why we read.
And Luke wasn't speaking from what he saw, he was speaking from what others told him.
Speaking from eyewitness accounts.
Yeah, we could say same thing with Mark, who is reporting Peter's experiences.
All right. And, the audience for Luke doesn't need it to tie back to the Old Testament. The audience for Matthew does.
I think, as we've said before too, if you witness an accident of four different people, each one will give you a slightly different account of what they saw.
All right. Dave, can you pick up?
So those who were sent went away and found it just as he had told them. And as they were untying the colt, its owner said to them, "Why are you untying the colt?" And they said, "The Lord has need of it." And they brought it to Jesus, and throwing their cloaks on the colt, they set Jesus on it. And as he rode along, they spread their cloaks on the road. As he was drawing near, already on the way down the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of his disciples began to rejoice and praise God with a loud voice for all the mighty works that they had seen, saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." And some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." He answered, "I tell you, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out."
All right. Do we remember what the stones is referring to? As he's coming through the Kidron Valley? Graves. Right. All right. Can somebody else pick up at 41?
When he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying,
All right, hold on a second, please. Why is that significant?
He's prophesying destruction.
Prophesied the destruction of the temple.
Not only that,
Oh,
what was the first sentence?
when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it.
He wept over it. How many times in the Bible does Jesus weep?
At least twice.
Lazarus.
Only twice. Only twice does it say Jesus wept.
Yeah.
Yeah. Only twice does it say in the Bible that Jesus wept. The death of Lazarus and when he saw Jerusalem on that final week. Tracy, please.
Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace. But now they're hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade against you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you. And they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation. And he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold, saying to them, "It is written, my house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers."
So again, in this sentence, in this case, Luke is presenting, the facts of what happened, but he's not playing it up like Matthew, right? There's no talk about Jesus overturning the tables, using the cord of his robe as a whip. So Luke, very matter of fact. Tracy, I'm sorry, I interrupted you again.
And he was teaching daily in the temple. The chief priests and the scribes and the principal men of the people were seeking to destroy him, but they did not find anything they could do, for all the people were hanging on his words.
Okay. All right, so now we're entering that final week. And so there's a lot going on. And the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, all the religious leaders are wound up. They're looking for ways to trick him, to get him to say something. They can run to Pilate and say, look what he's doing. He's going against Rome. Or they can bring the people and say, look at this blasphemy. So somebody want to start? So there are six interactions in chapter 20, and they kind of follow an interesting pattern. Somebody start with Luke and read chapter 20, verses 1 through 8.
One day as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple and preaching the gospel, the chief priests and the scribes with the elders came up and said to him, "Tell us by what authority you do these things, or who is it that gave you this authority?" He answered them, "I will ask you a question. Now tell me, was the baptism of John from heaven or from man?" And they discussed it with one another, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say, 'Why did you not believe him?' But if we say from man, all the people will stone us to death, for they are convinced that John was a prophet." So they answered they did not know where it came from, and Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things."
So we think there's political tension today. If I say the wrong thing, they're going to stone me. So here we've got an instance of the religious leaders challenging Jesus' authority, and he shuts them down. 9 through 18, somebody please.
And he began to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard and left it out to tenants and went into another country for a long while. When the time came, he sent a servant to the tenants so that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent another servant, but they also beat and treated him shamefully and sent him away empty-handed. and he sent a third. This one also they wounded and cast out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Let us kill him so that the inheritance may be ours." And they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When they heard this, they said, "Surely not." But he looked directly at them and said, What then is this that is written? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone?
So, once again, Jesus is using the Old Testament to strengthen, to allow people to see where he is answering the prophecies, where he is the answer. Psalm 118 is the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Who are the tenants in this situation?
The Jews. The chief priests, the Pharisees, the Levites, the scribes.
The religious leaders of the day.
Yeah,
That would also be us today when we reject him.
sure can be.
So the vineyard, although I didn't say, the vineyard I imagine are the Jews. It's the population. The tenants have the responsibility to tend the vineyard, to teach the people, to bring them up in the word. But instead of doing that, they use their authority to enrich themselves, to make their own rules, to set themselves above others. So what does God do? He sends, the owner sends a servant, God sends prophets. Said, what's going on isn't right. Kill the prophet, send another prophet, kill another prophet, send the son. So, the religious leaders, they recognized what he was saying, and didn't really like it. 19 through 26.
The scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told them this parable against them, but they feared the people. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be sincere, that they may catch him in something he said, so as to deliver him to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. So they asked him, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly, and show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not?" But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, "Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have?" They said, "Caesar's." He said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he said, but marveled at his answer. They became silent.
So once again, I think there's a pretty easy connection, parallel. You could tie them to politicians, and they're rile somebody up, bring people to their side. What do they yell? What about these taxes? No one likes taxes. So this poll tax that they're talking about is in effect forcing the Jews to pay homage to Caesar. So they know nobody likes it. So they're trying to trap Jesus, and they figure if he says, "Yeah, you've got to pay the tax," the people will rebel. If he says, "No, you don't have to pay the tax," they run to Pilate and say, "Sedition, thank you. I was grasping for a word."
What about the insincerity? You truly teach the word of God and they believe that.
So such
Yeah.
irritating, isn't it? Trying to butter them up first.
Yeah, and then catch them.
Yeah. So this one, this next one though is I think is one of my favorites. 27 through 40. Somebody wants to read?
There came to him some Sadducees, those who deny that there is a resurrection, and they asked him a question, saying, Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, having a wife but no children, the man must take the widow, raise an offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first took a wife and died without children, and the second and the third took her, and likewise all 7 left no children and died. Afterward the woman also died. In the resurrection therefore, whose wife will the woman be? For the 7 had her as wife. And Jesus said to them, the sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy to attain to that age and to the resurrection from the dead, neither marry nor are given in marriage. For they cannot die anymore, because they are equal to angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. But that the dead are raised, even Moses showed in the passage about the bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. Now he is not God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him.
All right, so the irony, I love the irony in this. Who are the Sadducees?
They're one of the sects of the Jewish leadership that does not believe in resurrection or life after.
The Sadducees do not believe at all in life after death. And they're asking Jesus what happens, in this case, after death, with this wife and her seven husbands. And then after he answers it, he gets another jab in there, saying, not only is this not important is not the word I'm looking for, but not only are you looking at the wrong things, but your entire belief system is wrong, because God is not the God of the dead, he is the God of the living. And these men, and because dead men can't have gods, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses are all alive. They're alive in him. So, not only does he swat at them, he swats at them twice.
But he also says, I am their God. He doesn't say I was their God.
Yes, he takes everything and brings it into the present tense. There's no past tense in his discussion. Exactly.
He is.
All right, so far we've had the religious leaders challenging Jesus' authority, Jesus using a parable to compare his authority to that of the religious leaders, the scribes and chief priests using the law to try to discredit Jesus, the Sadducees using the law to try and discredit Jesus, and now we get to verse 41 through 43. Then he said to them, how can they say that the Messiah is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. David thus calls him Lord, so how can he be his son? What's the answer? So Psalm 110 is talking about a being who is above David, but below God, in a sense. So how can he be both this entity, but also David's son? There's only one answer.
He's got to be God's son.
It's the incarnation. He is both God and man. That is the only way that this happens. So again, pulling on Old Testament to show that he is the answer. And lastly,
And apparently with that question to them, they didn't ask him any more questions.
no. They didn't ask him any more questions, but he has one more thing to say to them. Guys, I am very sorry. Sing well. Verse 45. Somebody read that?
While all the people were listening, Jesus said to his disciples, "Beware of the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely."
All right, and that it kind of folds in with the first story of chapter 21, where he says, he looked up and saw rich people putting their gifts into the treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. He said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in all she had to live on." Kind of feel like if they were redoing the chapters and verses, that might be pulled up into chapter 20. Because it just kind of sums it up. So his last point, the last point being that Jesus is challenging the religious leaders' authority. He's saying you don't exist for God's will, you exist for your own will. You exist to be exalted. At the same time, you're stealing widows' houses, which is a pretty sharp rebuke. So there's a whole nother chapter to go. It is, it's a lot of prophecy about the fall and the second coming. But I will play the video. So
Ever feel left out? Then you can identify with me. I was Peter's brother. Peter, the outspoken one of the apostles, and maybe the best known. As young men, we were fishing partners with James and John, the sons of Zebedee. The 4 of us were inseparable.
Andrew was an apostle and one of the first followers of Jesus. He was almost in Jesus' inner circle, but not quite. Was he not good enough? Or did he not truly understand his situation at the time?
We were some of the earliest of Jesus' followers and continued to be very close. But the longer we were with Jesus, the more I seemed to be distanced from the other 3. For instance, when Jesus went on the Mount of Transfiguration, he took the other 3, but not me. On the night Jesus was betrayed by Judas and he went to pray, he took the other 3, but not me. In fact, except for Jesus calling me and then me telling Peter about Jesus, I am hardly ever mentioned, except in the listings of the apostles. Well, John did mention that I pointed out the boy with the 5 loaves and 2 fishes that kick-started the feeding of the 5,000. And I did get to join the other 3 when Jesus talked about the upcoming destruction of the temple. I was certainly never as important as Peter, James, and John. I've wondered all my life why things turned out that way. Not smart enough, not personable enough. Did I do something wrong? Maybe it caused Jesus to not like me as much as the other 3? I would never know during my lifetime why things turned out that way. But as I drew near to the end of my life, here's what I began to think. Jesus knew I depended too much on the other 3, and he wanted me to depend only on him. narrowly spared. Jesus knew that I would spend most of my adult life by myself as I went around spreading the gospel. He knew how I needed to develop, even though it made me feel left out. Perhaps you are developing some good characteristics during your time of feeling left out. I was with the other apostles when Jesus left Jericho and started toward Jerusalem. We didn't know it, but Jesus was nearing the end of his life and would spend his last week on earth teaching in his Father's house, the temple. After a long day of walking from Jericho, we approached the towns of Bethphage and Bethany, which are located near the east side of the Mount of Olives, only a few miles from the temple. He turned to two of the disciples and told them to go to the next village and find a donkey colt there which no one had ridden, untie it, and return with it. If anyone questioned them, they were to simply say that the Lord needed it. Knowing that Jesus had friends in the area, none of us thought much about the request, other than Jesus didn't seem tired enough to need a donkey. Sometime later, they returned and reported that they had been questioned, as Jesus suspected, and the owners of the donkey had let them have it after hearing their reply. Some of us tossed our cloaks on the donkey since it had no blanket, and Jesus got on to ride. And that's when things went wonky. As our group went along the road, people started laying their cloaks on the ground. We began to understand that Jesus was enacting the role of a king, a victorious king. When we topped the Mount of Olives, it took our breath away. Across the Kidron Valley, the temple was gleaming in the midday sunlight, its gold plating. On the east, who had traveled for Passover were camped out. Their campfire smokes rose in the air like thousands of fires of sacrifice. Broke out in we got, the more the as Jesus started down a steep path, more cloaks were placed on him. Praise. Blessed of the Lord, and God in the highest. Psalms were quoted, and the people believed they were seeing their Messiah. But their enthusiasm would soon be quenched. The jealous Pharisees and the crowd immediately started demanding that Jesus silence his disciples. He told them that if his disciples were quiet, the very stones would praise him. As he neared the Kidron Valley at the bottom of the hill, Jesus began to weep. In words that none of us could fully comprehend, he began to prophesy about the upcoming destruction of the city and the temple. He knew Jerusalem was God's special possession, and he could see its destruction as surely as he could see the dust and rocks on the path in front of him. He also knew that its future could change if its citizens would just recognize him as the Lord. He also knew that they would not. Let's pause. I need to point out something important for you to remember as you read any of the Gospels. None of them were written in strict chronological order like you're used to. The writer's intent was to impart truth, not follow a writing convention, an unimportant writing convention at that. Luke uses this time in his narrative to talk about Jesus cleansing the temple, while Mark and Matthew place that event much earlier in their narratives. Regardless of when Jesus cleansed the temple by driving out the money changers, or if he did it 2 different times, you can rest assured that it did happen. For several days in the last weeks of his life, Jesus kept a predictable pattern. He would rise early and pray, walk to the temple with his disciples and teach the people, and then return to the Mount of Olives where he would spend the night. The Jewish officials were so unhappy with Jesus that they wanted to kill him. But the people were so enamored with him that the officials couldn't risk a riot. The Roman soldiers in the Antonia fortress at the northwest corner of the temple grounds, they were just waiting for an excuse to exert their superiority, and a riot would be a perfect excuse. The Jewish officials tried to downplay Jesus to the people so they could maintain their own authority, but he would turn the tables on them. One day they went directly at him by asking him by whose authority he taught. They were accustomed to exerting authority that they had given each other, or the authority that came from being a descendant of Aaron. Apparently they hadn't learned that Jesus wasn't an easy victim. Jesus replied, I will also ask you a question. Tell me, John's baptism, was it from heaven or of human origin? That confounded them. Many of them had been baptized by John the Baptist, and the entire crowd revered John as a true prophet. They knew the crowd would violently turn on them if they said human origin. They didn't want to agree that John was a prophet, so they replied that they didn't know where it was from. Jesus then refused to answer their question, which delighted the crowd. Another time, they wanted to trap Jesus into saying something that could cause the Romans to take him away. Knowing that people hated paying taxes to the Romans, the Jewish authorities asked the precarious question, is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Okay, so that question was charged in other ways. First, by paying taxes to Caesar, it was almost like agreeing to the emperor worship that the Romans demanded. Second, the Jews had to convert their money to Roman money in order to pay the taxes, which was costly. And the Roman money had images of the emperor on it, so it was like they were handling an idol when they handled Roman money. Seeing through their duplicity, Jesus requested that they show him a denarius coin. Presumably someone had a denarius and showed it to him. That in itself might have made them look bad. And then Jesus asked, whose image and inscription is on it? By using the word image, Jesus was emphasizing the nature of the coin being an idol, because inscriptions typically glorified either the emperor or the empire. And the image on it was of the emperor. It was obvious that the coin was not of God. His conclusion was simply, then give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Rather than answering their question, he taught them about the correct way to look at life. There are so many other stories to tell about the days before Jesus died, but I want to end with my most favorite in Luke's book. I like it because the hero of the story was someone who must have felt left out, like me. And that we Jews had to give a tithe to God. In reality, most the tithe wasn't. On top of that, we were required to give festivals. We had to pay a temple tax, and most of us gave other voluntary offerings for various reasons. One way to give our offerings on the temple grounds was to throw coins into some metal bowls, shaped somewhat like a cornucopia horn. Heavy coins would bounce down the horn and make loud sounds, while small coins would barely be noticed. Just by listening, everyone could tell who was throwing in what amount. As our group was standing there, an older, poor widow approached. I watched Jesus look at her and thought, maybe she reminded him of his own mother. As he watched intently, those around him began watching and listening too. I could hear the echoes of the rich people's coins as they bounced down the horns. You can just imagine that some of them tried to impress Jesus by throwing in a lot of money. And then I watched the widow. She feebly reached out and dropped her offering. As the coins fell, I had to strain to hear the tiny little faint ping, 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 ping. And I felt so sorry for her, since she knew we were all watching. Then I saw the tears in Jesus' eyes. He had to be thinking of his mother. He said, truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of those rich people. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. I started crying too. The poverty of that widow was in stark contrast to the wealth of the temple and many of the Jewish leaders. Much of the temple and its ornaments were gold-plated or made of solid gold. When the sun shone, the temple was so brilliant as to be blinding. It was so overwhelming that we disciples couldn't help but comment on its beauty. Jesus' response was so mysterious that we were confused then, and people are still confused 2,000 years later. As pertains to the temple buildings, Jesus seems to have been specifically prophesying how the temple would be destroyed by the Romans 40 years in the future. The very gold that was so beautiful to the disciples would be the cause for the Romans to tear the temple and part of the Temple Mount to pieces. In order to find the gold that melted in the fires of 70 AD, the Romans would literally, even 2,000 years later, you could go to the Temple Mount and see the enormous stones that were thrown down. They've left them exactly as they were to this day. Some of Jesus' remarks appears to have caused some of the Christians to flee the city prior to the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. Although Jesus' prophecies seem to be relatively straightforward concerning the temple, it is far from clear how Jesus addressed the topics concerning the end of the age, when he would return, and other subjects. For that reason, the chapters of Matthew 24 and 25 and Luke 21 are rich material for those who study prophecy. Without being flippant or understating the importance of Jesus' prophecies, I'll sum up what Jesus said. Nobody knows when the end will come, either for any person or for the world. So always be ready. Be ready by preparing to withstand persecution and by behaving as a disciple of Jesus. Every day, approximately 152,000 people die in the world. Yesterday, the world ended for approximately 152,000 people. You are wise, Jesus says, if you are ready for your world to end, and foolish if you're not. Loneliness, feeling left out. That's how I started my story. I couldn't see how Jesus was getting me ready. My talent was to introduce people to him, and he wanted to sharpen that talent, that desire in me. Peter, I introduced him to Jesus. The little boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish, I introduced him to Jesus. A bunch of Greeks who had one chance to meet him, I introduced him to Jesus. I overcame my loneliness by introducing people to Jesus. I have a feeling the same thing will work for you.
All right, real quick, lightning round. Chapter 21. So, as Andrew said, it starts off talking about the destruction of the temple, how the Romans will come in, knock it all down. They do. He warns then of false prophets, wars, and disasters, everything that's going to come before he returns. And then in verse 12, he says, but before all this, your life is going to be really bad. You may be admired right now, but soon your parents will disown you. Your brothers will look to turn you into the government. You'll be beaten. You'll be, some of you will be killed. He said, but then he reassures them and says, do not think about that. Do not worry about how you're going to defend yourself. If you are brought before somebody, I will put the words into your mouth. I will defend you. He goes on to say, to talk a little bit about, if you pay attention to what's going on around you, you will know when the second coming is coming. He says, just as people see the fig tree starting to bloom and know that summer is coming, you will know that I am coming. And he also, it says, which I found interesting as I was reading through it, and I'm almost done, I promise you. This generation, truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all things have taken place. And as I was studying more through that, thinking this generation, taking it literally, meaning, being the reason why some people would think that Jesus was coming back in their lifetimes, he's talking about unbelievers. The unbelievers are the generation that will not pass away until he returns. Then he closes by saying, don't be discouraged, don't fall into sinful ways, and be ready to live your life and be ready to stand before me. So that's it. Closing prayer. Lord, we thank you again for this opportunity to learn and read your word and study it together. We pray that we're able to take these teachings to heart and go out